Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. And this is Roman Colleges of Artificers from the Encyclopedia of Freemasonry by Albert G. Mackey. Roman Colleges of Artificers. It was the German writers on the history of the institution, such as Krause, Heldmann, and some others of less repute, who first discovered, or at least first announced to the world, the connection that existed between the Roman Colleges of Architects and the Society of Freemasons. The theory of Krause on this subject is to be found principally in his well-known work entitled Die drei ältesten Kunstekunden, the three oldest craft documents. He there advances the doctrine that Freemasonry as it now exists is indebted for all its characteristics, religious and social, political and professional, its interior organization, its modes of thought and action, and its very design and object to the Collegia Artificum of the Romans, passing with but little characteristic changes through the Corporationen von Baukunstlern, or architectural guilds of the Middle Ages, up to the English organization in the year 1717. So that he claims an almost absolute identity between the Roman colleges of Numa, 700 years before Christ, and the lodges of the 19th century. We need not, according to his view, go any farther back in history, nor look to any other series of events, nor trouble ourselves with any other influences for the origin and the character of Freemasonry. This theory, which is perhaps the most popular one on the subject, requires careful examination, and in the prosecution of such an inquiry, the first thing to be done will be to investigate. So far as authentic history affords us the means, the true character and condition of these Roman colleges. It is to Numa, the second king of Rome, that historians, following after Plutarch, ascribe the first organization of the Roman colleges, although, as Newman reasonably conjectures, it is probable that similar organizations previously existed among the Alban population and embraced the resident Tuscan artificers. But it is admitted that Numa gave to them that form which they always subsequently maintained. Numa, on ascending the throne, found the citizens divided into various nationalities, derived from the Romans, the Sabines, and the inhabitants of neighboring smaller and weaker towns who, by choice or by compulsion, had removed their residence to the banks of the Tiber. Hence resulted a disseverance of sentiment and feeling and a constant tendency to disunion. Now the object of Numa was to obliterate these contending elements and to establish a perfect identity of national feeling, so that, to use the language of Plutarch, the distribution of the people might become a harmonious mingling of all with all. For this purpose he established one common religion and divided the citizens into curiae and tribes, each curia and tribe being composed of an admixture indifferently of Romans, Sabines, and the other denizens of Rome. Directed by the same political sagacity, he distributed the artisans into various guilds or corporations under the name of collegia, or colleges. To each collegium was assigned the artisans of a particular profession, and each had its own regulations, both secular and religious. These colleges grew with the growth of the Republic, and although Numa had originally established but 9, namely the College of Musicians, of Goldsmiths, of Carpenters, of Dyers, of Shoemakers, of Tanners, of Smiths, of Potters, and a 9th composed of all artisans not embraced under either of the preceding heads, they were subsequently greatly increased in number. 80 years before the Christian era, they were, it is true, abolished, or sought to be abolished by a decree of the Senate, who looked with jealousy on their political influence. But 20 years afterward, they were revived, and new ones established by a law of the tribune Clodius, which repealed the Senatus Consultum. They continued to exist under the empire, were extended into the provinces, and even outlasted the decline and fall of the Roman power. And now let us inquire into the form and organization of these colleges, and in so doing, trace the analogy between them and the Masonic lodges, if any such analogy exists. The first regulation, which was an indispensable one, was that no college could consist of less than 3 members. So indispensable was this rule that the expression tre faciunt collegium, 3 make a college, became a maxim of the civil law. So rigid too was the application of this rule that the body of consuls, although calling each other colleagues, and possessing and exercising all collegiate rights, were, because they consisted only of 2 members, never legally recognized as a college. The reader will very readily be struck with the identity of this regulation of the colleges and that of Freemasonry, which with equal rigor requires 3 Freemasons to constitute a lodge. The college and the lodge each demanded 3 members to make it legal. A greater number might give it more efficiency, but it could not render it more legitimate. This, then, is the first analogy between the lodges of Freemasons and the Roman colleges. These colleges had their appropriate officers, who very singularly were assimilated in stations and duties to the officers of a Masonic lodge. Each college was presided over by a chief or president, whose title of magister is exactly translated by the English word master. The next officers were the decuriones. They were analogous to the Masonic wardens, for each decurio presided over a section or division of the college. Just as in the most ancient English and in the continental ritual, we find the lodge divided into 2 sections or columns, over each of which one of the wardens presided, through whom the commands of the master were extended to the brethren of his column. There was also in the colleges a scriber or secretary who recorded its proceedings, a thesaurensis or treasurer who had charge of the common chest, a tabularius, or keeper of the archives, equivalent to the modern archivist. And lastly, as these colleges combined a peculiar religious worship with their operative labors, there was in each of them a sacerdos or priest who conducted the religious ceremonies and was thus exactly equivalent to the chaplain of a Masonic lodge. In all this we find another analogy between these ancient institutions and our Masonic bodies. Another analogy will be found in the distribution or division of classes in the Roman colleges, as the Masonic lodges have their master masons, their fellow crafts, and their apprentices, so the colleges had their seniores, elders or chief men of the trade, and their journeymen and apprentices. The members did not, it is true, like the Freemasons, call themselves brothers, because this term, first adopted in the guilds or corporations of the Middle Ages, is the offspring of a Christian sentiment. But, as Krause remarks, these colleges were, in general, conducted after the pattern or model of a family, and hence the appellation of brother would now and then be found among the family appellations. The partly religious character of the Roman Colleges of Artificers constitutes a very peculiar analogy between them and the Masonic lodges. The history of these colleges shows that an ecclesiastical character was bestowed upon them at the very time of their organization by Numa. Many of the workshops of these artificers were erected in the vicinity of temples, and their curia, or place of meeting, was generally in some way connected with the temple. The deity to whom such temple was consecrated was peculiarly worshipped by the members of the adjacent college and became the patron god of their trade or art. In time, when the pagan religion was abolished and the religious character of these colleges was changed, the pagan gods gave way through the influences of the new religion to Christian saints, one of whom was always adopted as the patron of the modern guilds, which, in the Middle Ages, took the place of the Roman colleges. Hence, the Freemasons derived the dedication of their lodges to St. John from a similar custom among the corporations of builders. These colleges held secret meetings, in which the business transacted consisted of the initiations of neophytes into their fraternity and of mystical and esoteric instructions to their apprentices and journeymen. They were, in this respect, secret societies like the Masonic lodges. There were monthly or other periodical contributions by the members for the support of the college, by which means a common fund was accumulated for the maintenance of indigent members or the relief of destitute strangers belonging to the same society. They were permitted by the government to frame a constitution and to enact laws and regulations for their own government. These privileges were gradually enlarged and their provisions extended, so that in the latter days of the empire, the colleges of architects especially were invested with extraordinary powers in reference to the control of builders. Even the distinction so well known in Masonic jurisprudence between legally constituted and clandestine lodges seems to find a similitude or analogy here, for the colleges which had been established by lawful authority and were therefore entitled to the enjoyment of the privileges accorded to those institutions were said to be collegia licita, or lawful colleges, while those which were voluntary associations not authorized by the express decree of the Senate or the Emperor were called collegia illicita, or unlawful colleges. The terms licita and illicita were exactly equivalent in their import to the legally constituted and the clandestine lodges of Freemasonry. In the colleges, the candidates for admission were elected, as in the Masonic lodges, by the voice of the members. In connection with this subject, the Latin word which was used to express the art of admission or reception is worthy of consideration. When a person was admitted into the fraternity of a college, he was said to be cooptatus in collegium. Now, the verb cooptare, almost exclusively employed by the Romans to signify an election into a college, comes from the root op, which also occurs in the Greek oxponai, meaning to see, to behold. This same word gives origin in Greek to epoptes, a spectator or beholder, one who has attained to the last degree in the Eleusinian mysteries, in other words, an initiate, so that without much stretch of etymological ingenuity, we might say that cooptatus in collegium meant to be initiated into a college. This is at least singular, but the more general interpretation of cooptatus is admitted or accepted in a fraternity, and so made free of all the privileges of the guild or corporation. Hence the idea is the same as that conveyed among the Freemasons by the title of free and accepted. Finally, it is said by Krause that these colleges of workmen made a symbolic use of the implements of their art or profession. In other words, that they cultivated the science of symbolism. And in this respect, therefore, more than in any other, is there a striking analogy between the collegiate and the Masonic institutions. The statement cannot be doubted. For as the organization of the colleges partook, as has already been shown, of a religious character, and as it is admitted that all the religion of paganism was eminently and almost entirely symbolic, it must follow that any association which was based upon or cultivated the religious or mythological sentiment must cultivate also the principle of symbolism. We have thus briefly but succinctly shown, says Dr. Mackey, that in the form, the organization, the mode of government, and the usages of the Roman colleges, there is an analogy between them and the modern Masonic lodges, which is evidently more than accidental. It may be that long after the dissolution of the Roman colleges, Freemasonry and the establishment of its lodges designedly adopted the collegiate organization as a model, after which to frame its own system. Or it may be that the resemblance has been the result of a slow but inevitable growth of a succession of associations arising out of each other, at the head of which stands the Roman colleges. This problem can only be determined by an investigation of the history of these colleges and of the other similar institutions which finally succeeded them in the progress of architecture in Europe. We shall then be prepared to investigate with understanding the theory of Krause, and to determine whether the lodges are indebted to the colleges for their form alone, or for both form and substance. We have already seen that in the time of Numa, the Roman colleges amounted to only 9. In the subsequent years of the Republic, the number was gradually augmented so that almost every trade or profession had its peculiar college. With the advance of the empire, their numbers were still further increased and their privileges greatly extended, so that they became an important element in the body politic. Leaving untouched the other colleges, we shall confine ourselves to the Collegia Artificum, the Colleges of Architects, as the only one whose condition and history are relevant to the subject under consideration. The Romans were early distinguished for a spirit of colonization. Their victorious arms had scarcely subdued a people before a portion of the army was deputed to form a colony. Here the barbarism and ignorance of the native population were replaced by the civilization and the refinement of their Roman conquerors. The Colleges of Architects, occupied in the construction of secular and religious edifices, spread from the great city to municipalities and the provinces. Whenever a new city, a temple, or a palace was to be built, the members of these corporations were convoked by the emperor from the most distant points, that with a community of labor they might engage in the construction. Laborers might be employed like the bearers of burdens of the Jewish temple, in the humbler and coarser tasks, but the conduct and the direction of the works were entrusted only to accepted members, cooptati, of the colleges. The colonizations of the Roman Empire were conducted through the legionary soldiers of the army. Now, to each legion there was attached a college or corporation of artificers, which was organized with the legion at Rome and passed with it through all its campaigns, encamped with it where it encamped, marched with it where it marched, and when it colonized, remained in the colony to plant the seeds of Roman civilization and to teach the principles of Roman art. The members of the college erected fortifications for the legion in times of war and in times of peace, or when the legion became stationary, constructed temples and dwelling houses. When England was subdued by the Roman arms, the legions which went there to secure and to extend the conquest carried with them, of course, their colleges of architects. One of these legions, for instance, under Julius Caesar, advancing into the northern limits of the country, established a colony which, under the name of Eboracum, gave birth to the city of York, afterwards so celebrated in the history of Freemasonry. Existing inscriptions and architectural remains attest how much was done in the island of Britain by these associations of builders. Druidism was at that time the prevailing religion of the ancient Britons, but the toleration of paganism soon led to an harmonious admixture of the religious ideas of the Roman builders with those of the Druid priests. Long anterior to this, Christianity had dawned upon the British Islands, for to use the emphatic language of Tertullian, Britain, inaccessible to the Romans, was subdued by Christ. The influences of the new faith were not long in being felt by the colleges, and the next phase in their history is the record of their assumption of the Christian life and doctrine. But the incursions of the northern barbarians into Italy demanded the entire force of the Roman armies to defend the integrity of the empire at home. Britain was abandoned, and the natives, with the Roman colonists who had settled among them, were left to defend themselves. These were soon driven, first by the Piets, their savage neighbors, and then by the Saxon sea robbers, whom the English had incautiously summoned to their aid, into the mountains of Wales and the islands of the Irish Sea. The architects who were converted to Christianity and who had remained when the legions left the country went with them. And having lost their connection with the mother institution, they became thenceforth simply corporations or societies of builders, the organization which had always worked so well being still retained. Subsequently, when the whole of England was taken possession of by the Saxon invaders, the Britons, headed by the monks and priests and accompanied by their architects, fled into Ireland and Scotland, which countries they civilized and converted, and whose inhabitants were instructed in the art of building by the corporations of architects. Whenever we read of the extension in barbarous or pagan countries of Christianity and the conversion of their inhabitants to the true faith, we also hear of the propagation of the art of building in the same places by the corporations of architects, the immediate successors of the legionary colleges. For the new religion required churches, and in time cathedrals and monasteries, and the ecclesiastical architecture speedily suggested improvements in the civil. In time, all the religious knowledge and all the architectural skill of the northern part of Europe were concentrated in the remote regions of Ireland and Scotland, whence missionaries were sent back to England to convert the pagan Saxons. Thus the Venerable Bede tells us, Ecclesiastical History, Book 3, chapters 4 and 7, that West Saxony was converted by Agilbert, an Irish bishop, and East Anglia by Fursey, a Scotch missionary. From England, these energetic missionaries, accompanied by their pious architects, passed over into Europe and effectually labored for the conversion of the Scandinavian nations, introducing into Germany, Sweden, Norway, and Ireland the blessings of Christianity and the refinements of civilized life. It is worthy of note that in all the early records the word Scotland is very generally used as a generic term to indicate both Scotland and Ireland. This error arose most probably from the very intimate geographical and social connections of the Scotch and the Northern Irish, and perhaps also from the general inaccuracy of the historians of that period. Thus has arisen the very common opinion that Scotland was the germ whence sprang all the Christianity of the northern nations, and that the same country was the cradle of ecclesiastical architecture and operative masonry. This historical error, by which the glory of Ireland has been merged in that of her sister country Scotland, has been preserved in much of the language and many of the traditions of modern Freemasonry. Hence the story of the Abbey of Kilwinning as the birthplace of Freemasonry, a story which is still a favourite of the Freemasons of Scotland. Hence the tradition of the apocryphal mountain of Herodin, situated in the northwest of Scotland, where the first or Metropolitan Lodge of Europe was held, hence the advanced degrees of Ecossis, or Scottish Master, which play so important a part in modern philosophical Freemasonry, and hence the title of Scottish Masonry applied to one of the leading rites of Freemasonry, which has, however, no other connection with Scotland than that historical one, through the corporations of builders, which is common to the whole institution. It is not worthwhile to trace the religious contests between the original Christians of Britain and the papal power, which after years of controversy terminated in the submission of the British bishops to the Pope. As soon as the papal authority was firmly established over Europe, the Roman Catholic hierarchy secured the services of the builders' corporations, and these, under the patronage of the Pope and the bishops, were everywhere engaged as traveling Freemasons in the construction of ecclesiastical and regal edifices. Henceforth, we find these corporations of builders exercising their art in all countries, everywhere proving, as Thomas Hope says, by the identity of their designs, that they were controlled by universally accepted principles and showing in every other way the characteristics of a corporation or guild. So far, the chain of connection between them and the Collegia Artificum at Rome has not been broken. In the year 926, a general assembly of these builders was held at the city of York in England. 4 years after, in 930, according to Rebold, Henry the Fowler brought these builders, now called Masons, from England into Germany, and employed them in the construction of various edifices, such as the cathedrals of Magdeburg, Meissen, and Merseburg. But Krause, who is better and more accurate as a historian than Rebold, says that as respects Germany, the first account that we find of these corporations of builders is at the epoch when, under the direction of Edwin of Steinbach, the most distinguished architects had congregated from all parts at Strasbourg for the construction of the cathedral of that city. There they held their general assembly, like that of their English brethren at York, enacted constitutions and established at length a Grand Lodge, to whose decisions numerous lodges or Hütten, subsequently organized in Germany, Bohemia, Hungary, France and other countries, yielded obedience. George Kloss, in his exhaustive work entitled Die Freimaurerei in ihrer wahren Bedeutung, True Meaning of Freemasonry, has supplied us with a full collation of the statutes and regulations adopted by these Strasbourg Masons, see Stonemasons of Germany. We have now reached recent historical ground and can readily trace these associations of builders to the establishment of the Grand Lodge of England at London in 1717, when the lodges abandoned their operative charters and became exclusively speculative. The record of the continued existence of lodges of free and accepted Masons from that day to this, in every civilized country of the world, is in the hands of every Masonic student. To repeat it would be a tedious work of supererogation, such is the history, and now what is the necessary deduction? It cannot be doubted that Krause is correct in his theory that the incunabula, the cradle or birthplace of the modern Masonic lodges, is to be found in the Roman Colleges of Architects. That theory is correct if we look only to the outward form and mode of working of the lodges. To the colleges are they indebted for everything that distinguished them as a guild or corporation, and especially are they indebted to the architectural character of these colleges for the fact, so singular in Freemasonry, that its religious symbolism, that by which it is distinguished from all other institutions, is founded on the elements, the working tools, and the technical language of the stonemason's art. But when we view Freemasonry in a higher aspect, when we look at it as a science of symbolism, the whole of which symbolism is directed to but one point, namely, the elucidation of the great doctrine of the immortality of the soul and the teaching of the two lives, the present and the future, we must go beyond the colleges of Rome, which were only operative associations. The speculative craft has borrowed from the older type to be found in the ancient mysteries, where the same doctrine was taught in a similar manner. Krause does not, it is true, altogether omit a reference to the priests of Greece, who, he thinks, were in some way the original, whence the Roman colleges derived their existence. But he has not pressed the point. He gives in his theory a preeminence to the colleges to which they are not in truth entitled. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.